Greetings to you and welcome to this flipped training session exploring authorship and the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. My name is Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University and the Professor of Cultural Studies at Charles Darwin University. And I'm here today to present this first section, this first part in our flipped training session. Today we're going to present some content for your consideration and reflection, and then we proceed to explore in the second part of this flipped training a series of scenarios that are appropriate to you, your discipline, and this point of your career. For many of us who have decided to become academics, there's an amalgam of motivations and inspirations and aspirations. But to be who we are, to be an academic, we have to have a belief in the future and a belief in the next generation of academics. And that belief guides our teaching, it guides our research, and yes, it guides our supervision. We write because we wish to connect our current research not only with the great scholars in the past, but the great scholars that are going to come after us. We write because we wish to build those connections in research. Research can, and often does, create profound intellectual generosity, but it also summons jealousy and cruelty and brutality, and yes, even theft. This topic, authorship, upsets me. It matters. And it upsets me for many reasons, but one is that it upsets our students. And I think about all the senior roles I've held in the last 10, 15 years, and about 25% of all the complaints I've handled through all those different roles have involved students complaining about authorship. So this is not a Charles Darwin University issue. This is an international higher education issue. But Australia does have a distinctive and a very different pathway to the discussion of research codes of conduct and of authorship. Australia's research culture, up to very recently actually, tethered funding to the amount of research that we produced. Now, the RAF in the United Kingdom, and to a lesser extent the REF in the United Kingdom, were quality-driven protocols. They weren't about the number of articles. Instead, colleagues produced 4 of their best articles in a 5-year period that were assessed by peer review. Now, because of this system, I think, it encouraged quite senior colleagues in the United Kingdom to conduct independent research, and if they were going to collaborate in that research, they would collaborate also with quite senior colleagues. But because Australia was driven by the number of publications for the first decade of the 21st century, it skewed a lot of our discussions about authorship. But we are now in different times. And the time has come, colleagues, that we have to acknowledge those different times. Acknowledge that past, acknowledge our past. Acknowledge how so many of us were exploited through this previous system. But also understand that there are very clear regulations that are in place now. There's an old trick that we all used to action in research, and that old trick used to involve asking 2 questions. And the first question was always, what changed? What changed? And the second question is, what's going to happen next? In 2018, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research was released. It was a revision of a previous code, and the 2018 version set out very broad but also very clear principles confirming ethical, honest, transparent research policies, processes and guidelines. And those guidelines are in place for all of us as researchers, but also for our higher education institutions. All national funding, including the NHMRC, must adhere to this code, and it is integral, foundational to our research training. In December 2019, the NHMRC, the ARC and Universities Australia released a subsequent document titled Supervision, a guide supporting the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. Now, this is a powerful and freely available document, and it's an important document because through this document, all excuses are now over. There is no courtesy authorship. There's no lab courtesy authorship. There's no, this is the way it's always been done in my discipline. This is the way it's always been done, and you need to add me to this article. All of that has now gone. These unjust practices are now in breach of the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. And the new code that was released in 2018 has very, very clear criteria for what constitutes authorship, what are the requirements to be an author. And I'll read you just one item, item 6 of the 2019 Supervisory Code. Quote, examples of breaches of the code that are related to supervision include but are not limited to failure by a supervisor to provide adequate guidance or mentorship on the responsible code of conduct to researchers or researcher trainees under their supervision, or demanding or accepting authorship of a research output on the basis of supervision where the individual does also not satisfy the authorship criteria as specified in the authorship guide. End of quote. Now, most of us, through most of our academic lives, as we've worked around the world, have seen dreadful behaviour in terms of academic authorship. I know that, I acknowledge what you've gone through, I acknowledge what we've all gone through. But Australia now, today, has powerful guidelines in place. And just because you supervise, it has nothing to do with authorship at all. All of us, you will have to prove your authorship by a very, very precise set of criteria. And these verification protocols are incredibly important for all of us as colleagues, but also for our students. And remember, this is not just higher degree students or honours students, this is undergraduate students if they're also involved in research. So therefore, it's very important that we have these honest and robust discussions very early in the candidatures of our higher degree students, and that we handle all agreements and discussions with robustness, but also with rigour, transparency, and a fair amount of kindness and compassion as well. Remember that in the Australian system, and this makes us quite different internationally, to be frank, in the Australian system, higher degree students own their IP, their intellectual property, unless they sign it away. And those contracts need to be signed very early in the higher degree student candidature. So if those great industry partnerships are going to be in place and IP is signed away, that has to be actioned quite early in the candidature. And without this contract and without this agreement, students own their IP. Full stop. Now, I know there are plenty of assumptions that exist about authorship, particularly when they're tethered to higher degree supervision. And I still hear supervisors around the country explain time and time again, often in a quite public forum, that if I take a student on, then I will have authorship with them on their articles. Now, if that's your expectation today, that may be fine, but you will now have to enact behavioural changes and verify that authorship via the code. Because, of course, assumptions are not enough. They never have been enough, really, but assumptions are certainly not enough now to ensure that you can become an author. We all know that assumptions in the higher degree space are incredibly damaging. My PhD supervisor, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, told me in the first meeting with me that he was going to get authorship on all my articles produced from the thesis. Now, even though I was an incredibly young woman, I laughed, and I laughed a lot because he didn't read a word of the thesis. I came to the candidature with a fully fleshed project. I knew what I was going to produce. He had no impact on it at all. So therefore, I published 9 refereed articles as the single author, directly coming from that PhD, and 6 further trailing articles from that PhD research. And I was the sole author. Now, my research masters in education that I did many, many years after the PhD. In fact, I did it when I was a full professor in the United Kingdom. I held a British chair. And what happened with authorship then was even more bonkers. I did a 50,000 word dissertation. I did it completely on my own. There was no input from the supervisor at all, no emails, no meetings, nothing at all. As a courtesy, I sent the thesis to the supervisor the day before I was submitting it to the portal, just as a courtesy. And she replied to that email and stated that I will be a co-author on everything that you publish from this thesis. Now, once more, I laughed. I laughed a lot. And then I reread the email a few times and I could see that she was actually quite serious. So then I proceeded to just send that email on to her dean and to the DVCR of that particular institution. Now, some very, very uncomfortable emails and email contact emerged through that conversation. But yes, she was refused authorship. There were no grounds for authorship. Now, you'll see both of those stories emerged before the current code of conduct. And determinations of authorship are much cleaner and crisper now. But all of us have to acknowledge within ourselves our academic literacy and also our academic history, what has brought us to this point. And we have to recognise how all the assumptions from our past continue to bubble through our present. Now, I am very, very staunch in my rights on an author, as an author, and I'm also very, very staunch on protecting the rights of my students as authors. And in their very first meeting with me, I specify and go through the code of conduct and talk about, if I write it, it is mine. If you write it, it is yours. If we write it together, it's ours. And we talk about authorship and the ranking of authors on that article. Overt, clear, precise. But I have one more story that I want to share with you where my supposedly staunch status crumbled very quickly. So I was a full professor in the United Kingdom and part of the RAE process. And I was in the first year of this particular appointment. I was on probation. And of course, a foreigner in the United Kingdom. And I was brought into the office of a very senior member of that university. And he said to me, as clearly as this, I need a 4th article for the RAE. I don't have time to write it. You will write it and you will add my name to it. It was as clear as that. And of course, I was frightened. I was a foreigner. I was under probation. And so I spent 18 hours a day for 7 days and I wrote that article. And I presented it to him, and this is where it gets really funny, can I say? So I presented the article to him, and he said, I don't know if I agree with this. And I said, well, it doesn't worry me at all. I've written it, so I'm going to publish it. You decide what you want to do. And he was then so desperate to enter the RAE that he added his authorship to a piece that he had no engagement with at all. In fact, didn't even agree with it. And by the way, his other 3 pieces, he was the 3rd author of 3. So I think we know what went on there. But again, that story was before the current code. The reason I'm telling you these stories is that authorship and authorship rights are about power. And if you think about it, this was me as a full professor. And I was having to manage a power differential with a very senior leader of a university. So you can see why I care so much about authorship, about power, about governance, and about regulation. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Let's understand, let's acknowledge, but now let's move beyond our experiences of authorship and go to the policy and the governance protocols that will guide our action every day. The Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research is really clear. There are 3 requirements that determine authorship, and authors must verify and prove that they hold 2 of these 3 elements. And they must hold 2 of these 3 elements via what's described as, quote, a substantial contribution, end of quote. Okay, let's get into these 3 elements. The first element is obviously the conception and the design of the project, so research design. The second element is analysis and interpretation of the data and data collection. That's the second. And the third is drafting and editing significant parts of the work, making a substantive contribution to altering the argument and interpretation of that article, substantive contribution. So this matters. You can see that we have to recognise the very substantive difference between supervising a research project and publishing from that research project. They are different entities. So for example, we can, and we all do, assist in the sharpening and the writing of research questions for our PhD students. But that is very different from designing the project for a particular article, book, or book chapter, or conference proceedings. So this ambiguity is what intensifies the anger and the confusion and the jealousy in this authorship space. One of my most horrible moments in international higher education, and you can see I still carry the memory with me to this day, is when I was a head of school and I could hear one of the B-level academics, so for my international colleagues, quite a junior academic, speaking very loudly in the corridor, so her friend could hear, but so could everyone else in the corridor. And she said, "I've told my student that I'm not going to even open up her file to look at it and read it unless she justifies and explains how I am going to be an author on every article from that PhD." So she wasn't even prepared to read a chapter of a PhD of a student she is supervising without guaranteeing that she will be an author from everything that comes from that PhD. So you can see the ambiguity that's emerging here. Reading a draft from a PhD and then gaining authorship on a refereed article. Drafting a PhD chapter does not connote authorship, and it does not connote authorship by the Australian Code of Conduct. You are not an author through drafting or editing. And remember, substantive contribution to drafting and editing the formulation of an argument. That's in the code. So for me, there is a continuum of reasons about why somebody decides to supervise a PhD or a research master's student. And it's a continuum, and on one end of the continuum is profound selfishness. On the other end of the continuum is profound intellectual generosity. So we're either supervising because we get a lot out of it, or we're supervising because we want to contribute and enable the next generation of scholars. Now, all of us are somewhere on that continuum. So it's important for me, important for you. Let's take a breath and locate ourselves on why we are doing this, what our motivations are. And it is important that we all ask ourselves, why are we supervising? Now, on the selfish end, on the sort of danger, Will Robinson danger end, the supervisor is using the student to enable their own research. So let's play the devil's advocate here. A supervisor thinks that they can cruise through some easy publications, get their names on some publications without doing too much work. I've seen that a lot. To avoid this situation, we all now today need to have overt, I would almost write them down to be frank, overt conversations with our students about IP, about authorship, and about ownership. And we must, by the code, talk about the code of research conduct with our students. We need to talk with them about the policy and the procedures. And also, we all need to ask ourselves, what sort of academic are we? If we need to leverage the work of our students to enable our career. I'm being provocative because I want to provoke you. Are you the supervisor that's simply interested in what you can get from your students? Be honest in the characteristic in yourself, if that's the case. And then from that honesty, start to summon the changes that will allow you to be compliant with the code of conduct. Now, I know I've been staunch here, and I'm sorry about that, but I can never really convey in language the scale of the horrific stories that I've heard and I've had to investigate as part of the code, where students have simply lost control of their research. And it's been hoovered up into the CV of their supervisors. Now, there are more positive reasons to supervise. It is a privilege to work with brilliant and interesting people creating a significant original contribution to knowledge. Supervision is also a way to pay back the gifts that international higher education has given to so many of us, so we can enable our disciplines and give them a future. Now, I know that each discipline has its own customs and practices and behaviour. I know that. But it is important to recognise that in Australia, the Research Code of Conduct is nationally configured and it is activated on all disciplines. There's no excuses. The code is activated on all disciplines. So if authorship is mishandled, then researchers are opening themselves up for claims of unethical conduct and in being in breach of the code. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you about what that looks like. So the code is very clear about how a breach is investigated. And this is what happens if anybody, including our students, but also including a member of the public, if anybody states that a breach of the code has occurred, this is the process that is undertaken. So the complainant writes to the DVCR with their complaint. So a breach is reported, and when that breach is reported, it must identify the specific circumstances and provide evidence through which the potential breach will be assessed. Now, the complainants must be honest here, and malicious complaints, which do exist, malicious complaints are handled by different policies in each institution. So these complaints are confidential, except when a legal action is in place, and occasionally procedural fairness will require that the identity of the complainant be revealed. We try to keep everything as private and confidential as possible, but sometimes, as you can imagine, if there's public material, the identity is revealed. So anonymous reports will be investigated, but can I just specify, and I've had to do these, when an anonymous breach is reported, it gets a bit complicated because we have to have enough information to be able to commence the investigation, because any investigation is an evidentially driven process. So information about the breach is passed on to the designated officer, the DO, who at CDU is the DVC research, unless there is a conflict of interest, and then that package is passed on to somebody else, and they are the DO. The designated officer then passes on all that information to the assessment officer, the AO. Now, on most occasions involving a higher degree student, the Dean of Graduate Studies, me, I will be the AO, unless I have a conflict of interest, and then it's passed on to another senior colleague, perhaps who's watching this gig today. Fantastic. So the assessment officer has particular functionalities here. Our role is to gather all the information we can from all the parties involved in this complaint, using text matching software if we remotely can, and we have to assess whether the complaint would constitute a breach. The key at this stage is this must be an evidentially driven process, not a vibe, not an assumption. We require and gather evidence. And this preliminary investigation must be completed within 10 working days. Yes, it is very intense. So the assessment officer then informs the designated officer of their preliminary assessment. And this preliminary assessment is based on evidence and via the balance of probabilities. And I'm using very precise language here. So a recommendation from the AO is offered, and there are 3 possible options that are offered at this point in terms of the recommendation. There is a case to answer. This case is referred to another institutional process, or the complaint is dismissed. 1, 2, 3. That's a recommendation. So then the designated officer informs the respondent of the outcomes of that preliminary assessment. Right. Now, if there is a case to answer, the designated officer then implements the next stage of the process. So firstly, the designated officer configures if the complaint can be solved locally with a consensual outcome. That can sometimes occur. The case is referred to investigation. The case is referred to other institutional policies and procedures, for example, like bullying processes or sexual assault, sexual harassment processes, or indeed the complaint can be dismissed. Right. So if the designated officer recommends an investigation, then the responsible executive officer, the Vice-Chancellor, appoints an investigation panel, and that panel reports directly to the Vice-Chancellor. The investigation panel can determine 2 outcomes. They locate a breach in the code. They locate that there has been no breach in the code. 1, 2. If no breach of the code is determined, then the allegation is either dismissed or referred to other institutional policies for management. Now, the determination of the recommendations of the actions following that investigation from the responsible executive officer, the VC, result in a couple of very significant actions. So corrective actions can be implemented. So an article is retracted. There can be a correction to the public record, so authors are added or authors are removed. And also, of course, disciplinary action can be activated from institutional policies and procedures. Right, so after all of that's occurred, a review of this investigation on the grounds of procedural fairness can be requested by any party. And of course, in the Northern Territory, that can involve ICAC. Okay, so I've given you that narrative not to frighten you, although it is frightening, but to explain what happens every single time a complaint is reported to the DVCR, stating that there has been a breach in the Code of Conduct. So how did we end up here? What happened? How have we ended up here? Well, let me provide you with a little bit of evidence about how we ended up here. Whistler et al. Reported that in a study of 6 prestigious medical journals, that 1 in 4 articles had an unjustified author, and 1 in 10 articles left off an author that should have been included. This research shows that what we're talking about today is not a case of a few bad apples, the occasional lapse. This is our academic culture. This is our reality. And this culture has to change. Authorship matters because it holds academic and economic and political credibility. But authorship now is strongly tethered to both responsibility and accountability. Increasingly, and I so welcome this, increasingly journals are asking for very clear and very publishable information about the contribution of each human being that's listed as an author on that article. And those authors have to sign off that contribution. It's been wonderful. It's been amazing to see the changes in the last 5 years and particularly the last 2 years. These are welcome transformations from our academic journals. Now, as we all know, authorship has 3 parts: research design, data collection, data analysis, and substantive writing and editing. We know that. To be an author on a publication today, you need to be able to demonstrate 2 of those 3 elements. Authorship must be discussed not only before an article is published, but actually when a student is enrolled. Supervisors have to be honest. We have to speak the words. What are our expectations of authorship? And how do those expectations align with the Research Code of Conduct? Past expectations and assumptions that we all live through. Colleagues, they were wrong then. And they're being managed by the code now. The code certainly does have a history, and of course that history is aligned with the legendary Vancouver Protocol that commenced when a very small group of medical journal editors met in, surprise, surprise, Vancouver in 1978. So authorship via the Vancouver Protocol was determined by, and this is quite meaningful to remember this, I think, at this point, is the whole point of the Vancouver Protocol was to determine if authors were involved enough to be able to take public responsibility for the content. So the Vancouver Protocol, although it's called many other things now, but the Vancouver Protocol still has some relationships that you will see with our current Australian code. Substantial contribution to the conception and design, the analysis and interpretation of data, so that's crucial. The drafting of the article to revise it critically for content. That's a very powerful part of the Vancouver Protocol. And of course, the bit that we need to remember, why I'm talking about it today, is the VP was very focused on all authors being able to enact the final approval of the final published version so that they could be responsible for it. So if contributors didn't meet those criteria, then they were not listed as authors. They may be acknowledged, but they're not listed as authors. So sourcing funding, providing the grant, or generating data collection, so running those samples, that's not enough to constitute authorship. The VP also recommends, and I agree with this and I use this in my own work, the VP recommends that there be a footnote for the order of authorship. So actually there is a footnote that explains the authorship is configured in this order for this reason. That's fantastic. And that's important. So it's no longer a question of, oh, well, look, this is what we do in the humanities, this is what we do in the science. That's rubbish, that's over. The National Code applies to all disciplines. But for example, where there are very bespoke authorship protocols, and I'm thinking particularly of mathematics with the Hardy-Littlewood protocol, the Hardy-Littlewood rule, then it does require, and a big hello to all our mathematics colleagues, you are wonderful, but if you're going to use the Hardy-Littlewood, then you do require an explanatory footnote to explain that is what you're doing and why it exists. And for colleagues that have never heard of the Hardy-Littlewood, it's a fascinating rule. We love our mathematicians, but it is that the mathematicians have listed themselves alphabetically where every author has an equal role. So that's great, but please provide a footnote to state that is what you've done and why you've done it and justify it. Now, we all know the Vancouver Protocol was configured to manage medical sciences, and the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research exists through all our disciplines. The challenge I think we have in the doctoral space, if I'm being really honest with you colleagues, is that the leader of the project, the head of the lab, etc., the leader of the project determines the order of the authors, and indeed who is the author, and so young researchers are incredibly disempowered in these environments. So I want to finish just with one story, and thank you so much for accompanying me through these very intricate and upsetting conversations. I understand that. But I want to finish with one final story, if I can, that happened to me not only this year, but in the last couple of months. So I was one of 5 authors in a British book. So a British publisher had commissioned this book, and I was one of the 5 authors. Now, I wrote my 3 chapters, and I waited for the other authors to produce their chapters. I'd written the introduction, but obviously I had a few paragraphs of the introduction that were sort of sketched out until I could actually read the other chapters and make sure that my interpretation was accurate. So while I was still waiting for these other chapters to be produced, one of the co-authors simply went into the Dropbox and edited one of my chapters, adding about half a paragraph and 3 references to my chapter. Now remember, one of the characteristics of authorship is that we agree to the content and that we are responsible for it. So to be an author, we must agree to be an author. So this co-author added content, added references, particularly on identity and identity politics, that I couldn't agree with and I couldn't attach my name to. So I pulled out of the project. And because I'd written about 1/3 of the book project collapsed. This is the seriousness of authorship. If we add ideas to somebody else's project that they don't agree with, the project stops. Authorship requires that we agree to be an author. And these decisions that we make, these decisions that other people make, have a debilitating function on all our careers. Now remember, I was a full professor and a dean when I pulled out of that project. And I did that so I could abide by the code. Being a researcher is a privilege. It has rights, and this role also has responsibilities. So I really look forward to working with you through our seminars as the second part of this flipped training, where we explore scenarios from academic life and investigate what we would have done then and what we will now do differently. Thank you so much for your time, and be well.